The grinding rattle of my garage door echoed like thunder down the quiet, suburban street, breaking the sleepy stillness of the morning. I stood just inside, watching the sunlight slice in across the concrete floor, waiting for the familiar gleam of my old polished Cadillac to catch the first rays of the day. The scent of oil and wax clung to the air, the smell of years spent maintaining something with my own two hands. But the moment that car came into view, everything shattered. "Hey!" A sharp, furious voice cut through the morning air. "What the hell are you doing with my car?" I blinked, stunned, as a figure stormed across the cul-de-sac. Tall, sharp-suited, barely 30, face twisted with rage. He was on me in seconds, jabbing a finger toward the Cadillac as if his sheer anger could rewrite history. "That's mine," he shouted, his breath hot, the veins in his neck straining. "I just bought that car yesterday. You think you can just steal from me and get away with it?" For a moment, I thought he was joking, but the fire in his eyes told me otherwise. Neighbors began to peek from behind curtains, blinds twitching. A few even stepped onto their porches, arms folded, whispering to each other as if they'd been waiting for the next episode of a neighborhood drama. I could feel their stares like spotlights, burning into me, judging me. "I... what?" "This is my car," I stammered, voice shaking but firm. "I've had it for years. Look, the plates, the papers." But he cut me off with a sudden chilling gesture, his phone pressed to his ear. "This is 911, he barked loud enough for everyone to hear. "Yeah, I want to report a theft. The guy at 214 Oak Lane just stole my vehicle. Yes, the Cadillac in his garage. Send officers immediately." I froze, my blood ran cold. Sirens, faint at first, began to wail somewhere in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. My heart slammed against my ribs like it wanted out, each beat carrying panic through my veins. He smirked, satisfied, arms crossed as if the cops were his personal enforcers. "You're going down for this, old man," he sneered. I looked at the Cadillac, the car I'd bought decades ago after finally saving enough from my job at the steel mill. The same car I'd driven to family vacations, to weddings, to funerals. It wasn't just a machine, it was a memory, a piece of me. And now, in front of the entire neighborhood, this arrogant kid was trying to erase all of it. The sirens grew closer. Red and blue lights flickered across the street, bouncing off windows and casting distorted shadows against the houses. My neighbors edged closer, eager for the show. Some had phones up, recording. Others whispered like vultures circling. I stood there, 65 years old, hands trembling at my sides, watching the world twist upside down around me. How could I prove it was mine in time? Would the cops believe me over him? Young, confident, the HOA golden boy who always strutted around as if he owned the place? Or would they drag me out in handcuffs, humiliate me in front of everyone, strip away not just my dignity, but my home, my freedom? The garage smelled of wax and gasoline. The street buzzed with whispers. My heart hammered with dread. And as the first squad car screeched to a halt, tires squealing, lights washing the world in chaotic color, only one thought screamed through my mind. How did a car I'd owned for decades suddenly become evidence against me? And how far was this man willing to go to destroy me? I should probably tell you who I am before I take you further into that moment. Before the sirens, the accusations, and the humiliation of being treated like a thief in my own garage. My name is Frank Harrison. I'm 65 years old, retired now. Though I spent 4 decades working the steel mills of our city, if you've never stepped into one of those furnaces, you'll never know the kind of heat that gnaws at your bones, the clang of iron against iron, the hiss of molten fire as it pours like lava through channels cut into the earth. That was my life for years. Long, brutal shifts, soot burning into my skin, lungs aching, but a paycheck steady enough to raise my family and keep a roof over our heads. The Cadillac sitting in my garage was the first truly extravagant thing I ever bought for myself. It wasn't brand new when I got it, but I saved for months to make sure I could pay outright. That car became a part of my identity, my way of telling myself I'd worked hard, endured enough, and finally had something to show for it. I kept it polished, every curve gleaming, chrome shining, leather soft. Friends used to joke that my wife thought I loved the Cadillac more than her, And though she'd roll her eyes, I knew she secretly understood. It wasn't just about the car. It was about pride, about survival, about every mile it carried me through the chapters of my life. After my wife passed 5 years ago, the Cadillac became even more important. It was the car we'd taken on our last trip together, a winding drive along the coast where she laughed with the ocean breeze in her hair. Sitting behind that wheel let me hold on to her memory. Losing it, or worse, having it stripped away publicly, would have felt like losing her all over again. Which brings me to him, Ethan Cole, 30 years old. The kind of man who seemed to walk through life with a smirk and a phone glued to his hand. He'd only moved into the neighborhood 2 years ago, but thanks to charm and money, he was already vice president of the HOA board, practically running things while the president acted as a silent figurehead. Ethan was sleek, always in tailored suits, even when he was just walking his dog. He drove a flashy Tesla that he made sure everyone saw. His smile was perfect, white as polished marble, but there was a coldness behind it. The kind of smile that said, "I can ruin you, and you won't even see it coming." At first, he pretended to be friendly. I remember him stopping me one afternoon as I trimmed my hedges. "Nice classic you've got there, Frank," he said, pointing to the Cadillac parked in the driveway. His tone was smooth, but I noticed how his eyes lingered too long on the car, scanning it as though it already belonged to him. "Had it a long time," I replied simply, a little protective. He nodded, then leaned closer. "You know, with cars like that, you really ought to keep them garaged. Wouldn't want something to happen. HOA has standards, you know." That was the first warning. It sounded casual, almost like advice. But I knew what it was. A threat wrapped in silk. After that, Ethan seemed to take a special interest in me. At meetings, he'd glance over whenever I spoke, smirking as though my words didn't matter. When new rules were proposed, no overnight guests without board approval, no vehicles older than 15 years parked in driveways, I could feel his eyes cutting into me, daring me to object. Neighbors whispered about his influence. Some admired his ambition, others feared it. More than once, I caught Mrs. Langley across the street muttering, "That boy's going to bring trouble," though she never said it loud enough for Ethan to hear. The petty harassment started small. A letter slipped into my mailbox about improper lawn maintenance, despite my yard being trimmed to the inch. A warning taped to my door about unauthorized decorations, because I'd hung a small flag for Veterans Day. And then the fines, $50 for leaving my garbage bin out an hour too long, $75 for a bird feeder attracting pests. Each one bore his signature at the bottom. I tried to shrug it off. At my age, you learn to pick your battles. But there was something in the way he'd grin at me from across the street, as if each fine was just another move in a game only he understood. Then came the car. One evening, I found him standing by the Cadillac, phone in hand, snapping photos. I walked up quickly, heart pounding. "Can I help you?" I asked, sharper than I meant. "Just documenting," he replied casually. "HOA is considering new guidelines for aged vehicles visible on property. Might want to brace yourself, Frank." He winked, then walked away whistling. I knew then that he wasn't just harassing me for sport. He wanted something. And the way his gaze lingered on that Cadillac, I could guess exactly what. For weeks, I had the uneasy feeling of being watched. The car became a target, not just for Ethan's attention, but for the neighborhood's curiosity. Some neighbors avoided looking directly, but others whispered openly. I'd catch fragments. "Isn't that against the rules?" Maybe Ethan's right. It's time he let it go. It wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about control. Ethan wanted to remind everyone that no matter who you were, how long you'd lived here, or what you'd worked for, he was the one in charge now. And though I didn't know it then, the confrontation in my garage, the shouting, the 911 call, was just the spark he'd been waiting to ignite. Because Ethan wasn't satisfied with fines or warnings or embarrassment. He wanted to strip me of the one thing I love most, and he was willing to lie, cheat, and manipulate the entire neighborhood to get it. The Cadillac wasn't just a car to him, it was leverage. And I was about to learn how dangerous a man like him could become when he believed he was untouchable. The squad cars that morning didn't end with me in handcuffs, though it came terrifyingly close. 2 officers stepped into my garage, their boots heavy against the concrete, their hands brushing their belts as though prepared to restrain me. "Sir, we got a call about a stolen vehicle," one of them said. His partner's eyes scanned the Cadillac, then darted back to Ethan, who stood outside with arms folded smugly. Neighbors gathered around him like he was putting on a play. "That's mine," I insisted, voice low but steady. "I've owned this car for decades. Papers are in the house. Registration matches. My name, not his." They checked, and sure enough, everything lined up in my favor. My name on the registration, my insurance, even an old photo tucked into the glove box of my wife and me leaning against the Cadillac 20 years ago. Evidence so clear, even Ethan's silver tongue couldn't spin it. But still, he didn't let it go. When the officers told him there was no crime here, Ethan chuckled. That cold, patronizing chuckle that made the hair on my neck rise. "Must be some misunderstanding," he said, his voice dripping with false charm. "But you know, these older folks sometimes get confused about what belongs to them." He didn't need the cops to arrest me. He just needed them to plant doubt in the neighbors' minds. And it worked. From that day forward, every glance felt heavier, every whisper sharper. People who once greeted me with warm smiles now offered tight nods, wary eyes flicking to the Cadillac as if it were evidence of my supposed dishonesty. Ethan's lie had sunk its claws deep, and the neighborhood was starting to believe him. The first letter came 2 days later. "Notice of violation," typed neatly at the top, stamped with the HOA's logo. It accused me of harboring an unauthorized vehicle on my property, specifically one that was not registered to the current resident. I stared at the paper, stunned. He'd taken the police report, the very one that proved him wrong, and twisted it into ammunition. I appealed, of course. I wrote back, attaching copies of my registration, my insurance, photographs, everything. I even drove to the HOA office, papers in hand, and demanded to speak with the board. But Ethan was there, sitting at the long table, his suit pristine, his smirk carved into stone. "We'll review your appeal," he said smoothly, taking the papers without looking at them. "In the meantime, fines will accrue daily until the matter is resolved." Fines. At first $50 a day, then $100. Within a week, the total had reached numbers that made my stomach churn. And every time I passed Ethan on the street, he gave me that look. The look of a man who knew exactly how much pain he was causing and relished every second of it. It didn't stop with letters. One morning I came out to find a long, deliberate scratch carved down the Cadillac's side. Not an accident. A jagged scar etched deep into the paint, almost daring me to prove who'd done it. Another time, the tires were mysteriously deflated, not slashed. That would have been too obvious. Just enough air let out to keep me stuck at home, struggling with the pump while Ethan walked his dog past, whistling, pretending not to notice. And then there were the late-night knocks. Always around midnight, sharp raps on the garage door, just enough to jolt me awake, my heart pounding. By the time I got up and looked outside, no one was there. But I knew. I always knew. Sleep slipped away from me. My hands trembled even when I tried to sit quietly with my morning coffee. My blood pressure rose. My doctor warned me to take it easy. But how could I, when every day felt like a siege? At first, a few neighbors tried to be kind. Mrs. Langley brought me a casserole one evening, murmuring that she didn't believe the rumors. Mr. Patel across the street quietly offered to sign a statement, saying he'd seen me with the Cadillac for years. But when Ethan found out, they both withdrew. Mrs. Langley avoided my house, eyes down when she walked her dog. Mr. Patel stopped waving. Fear had silenced them. Ethan ruled not just with charm, but with intimidation. Everyone knew that if you crossed him, you'd find yourself drowning in fines, citations, or worse. It was easier to nod along than resist, so I stood alone. If you've never been to an HOA meeting, you might think they're boring, but under Ethan's control, they became theater. And I was the unwilling star. "Next item," he'd announce, glancing down the agenda with fake formality. "Unresolved violation regarding Mr. Harrison's unauthorized vehicle." The room would buzz with whispers, all eyes on me. I'd rise, papers in hand, ready to defend myself yet again. "It's my car," I'd repeat, voice firm despite the tremor in my chest. "Here's the registration, signed and sealed. Here's proof of ownership going back decades. But Ethan always countered with a sly remark. Strange that there's confusion, though, isn't it? Almost like someone's trying to cover their tracks. He never outright called me a thief in those meetings. He didn't have to. His insinuations did the work for him, seeding doubt like weeds in the minds of everyone present. And every time the fines grew. It was late one night, weeks into this torment, when I found myself sitting in the garage, the dim bulb overhead casting shadows across the Cadillac's gleaming hood. My hands rested on the steering wheel, my chest tight. I thought about selling it. The thought felt like betrayal, like cutting away a piece of my soul. But the weight of the fines, the constant harassment, the isolation, it all pressed down until escape seemed the only option. I could hear Ethan's voice in my head, smug and victorious. You really ought to keep it garaged. Wouldn't want something to happen. And that's when I realized he wouldn't stop, not until he had what he wanted. He didn't want me gone. He wanted the car. The Cadillac wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It was a symbol, a trophy, proof that he could take anything from anyone, even a man who'd spent his life earning it. And I knew then, if I gave in, it wouldn't just be my car I lost, it would be my dignity, my history, my wife's memory. So I decided to fight. But how do you fight a man who controls the system, who twists every rule, every neighbor, every word into a weapon? I needed proof, not just of my ownership. That was already clear. I needed evidence of him, of his lies, his sabotage, his campaign of harassment, and to get that, I would have to set a trap. One that would catch Ethan in the act. One that would turn his arrogance against him. Because if there was one thing I'd learned about Ethan, it was this. He believed he was untouchable. And that was exactly the weakness I would use to bring him down. The trap began with silence. For weeks, I let Ethan believe he was winning. I stopped arguing at meetings. I paid the fines into escrow, quietly without protest. I let the whispers swirl unchecked, let him strut around the cul-de-sac with a smug grin. I even nodded politely when he walked past as though I'd surrendered. But behind the scenes, I was preparing. I bought a set of discreet cameras, tiny, motion-activated, nearly invisible, and installed them inside the garage and around the driveway. I kept a logbook, every incident carefully documented with times, dates, photos, and copies of letters. I even pulled old receipts and maintenance records for the Cadillac, stacking them into a binder thick enough to slam onto a table like a gavel. And then, the final piece. I went to the county records office and pulled property surveys, HOA charters, even past complaints lodged against Ethan that had mysteriously disappeared. What I found wasn't just negligence, it was corruption. Ethan had been waiving fines for his friends, approving violations selectively, and even altering documents. But still, I needed one last thing. Proof that he was targeting me deliberately. It came one night, almost like fate had delivered it. At 2 a.m., the camera in my garage caught him slipping inside. Key in hand, as though he owned the place. He crouched beside the Cadillac, flashlight glinting, snapping photos. Then, with a slow smile, he pulled a second set of license plates from under his jacket. Plates that weren't mine. He held them up to the bumper, mock-fitting them as though preparing to discover my car with the wrong registration. I froze watching the footage, my heart pounding. There it was, the smoking gun. Now it was time to strike. The next HOA board meeting was packed. Word had spread that the Cadillac dispute was reaching its peak. Neighbors filled every chair, the buzz of anticipation heavy in the air. Some leaned forward eagerly, hungry for drama. Others sat stiffly, their expressions tight, as if praying the whole ordeal would finally end. At the head of the room, Ethan presided like a king. His suit was impeccable, his hair slicked back, his smile razor sharp. Next on the agenda, he announced smoothly, the unresolved violation concerning Mr. Harrison's vehicle. All eyes turned to me. I stood slowly, my binder under one arm, my hands steady for the first time in weeks. This will be quick, I said. Ethan smirked. I'm sure it will. Let's get this over with. He leaned back, folding his hands, expecting another desperate plea. But instead, I set the binder on the table with a heavy thud. Inside, page after page of documentation, registration, insurance, receipts, photos. But I didn't start with that. No, I started with the video. I pulled out a small tablet, connected it to the projector, and hit play. Gasps filled the room as the footage appeared on the screen. Ethan slipping into my garage in the dead of night. Ethan crouched by the Cadillac. Ethan holding up stolen plates, his grin unmistakable. The room erupted. "Is that?" someone whispered. "Oh my God," another muttered. "Caught red-handed," Mr. Patel said loudly, his voice trembling with something between anger and relief. Ethan's face drained of color. His smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of panic he couldn't hide. This is taken out of context," he stammered, rising to his feet. "That footage is fake. Doctored. He's trying to frame me." I cut him off, my voice firm, louder than I thought possible. "Doctored? Then explain why these plates were found in the dumpster behind your office this morning." I held up a plastic evidence bag, inside which gleamed the very plates he'd held in the video. A few neighbors gasped again. Others began to murmur angrily, the tide turning like a storm. "This isn't just about me," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "I've got records here showing how you've altered HOA documents, waived fines for your friends, and used this board to line your pockets. I've spent weeks gathering proof, and now every bit of it is going to the county prosecutor." The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the whispers, louder and louder, until they erupted into full-blown outrage. "You lied to us. You've been stealing? Abusing power, just like we thought." Ethan tried to shout over them, but the crowd had turned. Even his allies on the board looked pale, shifting uncomfortably in their seats, unwilling to share in his downfall. Finally, the HOA president, a frail man who had always been Ethan's puppet, cleared his throat. "Mr. Cole," he said shakily, "you're suspended from this board effective immediately pending investigation." The room exploded in applause, cheers, and even a few relieved sobs. Ethan stood frozen, his jaw tight, eyes darting wildly as though searching for escape. But there was none. For the first time since he moved into this neighborhood, Ethan Cole was powerless. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors crowded around me, some offering apologies, others shaking my hand firmly. The tide had shifted completely. For weeks, I had been alone, isolated, humiliated. But now I stood vindicated. Ethan lingered near the back, his suit rumpled, his face pale. He tried one last time to regain footing, leaning close as I gathered my papers. "You think this ends me?" he hissed, his voice low, venomous. "You don't know who you're dealing with." I met his gaze evenly. For once, it was he who flinched. "You've spent months trying to strip me of my dignity," I said quietly, so only he could hear. "But dignity isn't yours to take, and now it's your turn to face the truth." His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He just stormed out, the sound of the door slamming behind him echoing like a final note. The next morning, the neighborhood was alive with chatter. Ethan's downfall was the only topic, whispered over fences, shouted across driveways, spread through group texts like wildfire. I sat on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the Cadillac gleam in the sunlight. For the first time in months, I felt peace. But I also knew it wasn't over. Not yet. Because exposing Ethan at the meeting was just the beginning. The real reckoning, the legal, undeniable, inescapable reckoning, was still to come, and I was ready for it. The morning after Ethan's humiliation, the neighborhood felt different. For months, I'd walked these streets under a cloud of suspicion. Every glance from a neighbor had felt like a dagger, every whisper like a judgment. But now the air was lighter. Mrs. Langley waved from her porch with a smile that seemed almost apologetic. Mr. Patel crossed the street to shake my hand, muttering, "Took a lot of guts, Frank. We should have stood by you sooner." The Cadillac gleamed in the driveway, its polished chrome reflecting the sunlight like a victory banner. For the first time in weeks, I left it out deliberately, daring anyone to question it. No whispers came, only nods, only respect. But the biggest shift wasn't in the neighbors. It was in me. For months, I'd felt powerless, trapped in a cage built from Ethan's lies and manipulations. He'd nearly broken me, pushing me to the brink of selling the very thing that represented my life's work and my wife's memory. Yet now, sitting behind the wheel again, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Dignity. The kind of dignity that comes not from winning, but from refusing to bow. Of course, Ethan didn't go quietly. Within days of the meeting, he tried spinning his own narrative. Emails went out to the neighborhood accusing me of doctoring the footage. A few die-hard loyalists parroted his claims, but most had seen enough. The video was undeniable. The plates in the dumpster sealed it. His credibility was gone. And then came the investigation. The county prosecutor's office, armed with the evidence I'd collected, launched a formal inquiry. Subpoenas were issued, records were pulled. Ethan's web of corruption unraveled strand by strand. Selective enforcement of fines, waived penalties for friends who contributed to his campaign fund. Even suspicious transfers from the HOA account to businesses tied to his family. The board, desperate to save face, voted unanimously to remove him. Neighbors who once feared him now shunned him. His confident stride through the cul-de-sac turned into hurried walks, eyes down, as if he could escape the stairs. And then one morning, a moving truck pulled up outside his sleek modern home. By sunset, Ethan Cole was gone. No farewells, no defenders, just silence. The legal battle ended months later. Ethan was indicted on charges of fraud, forgery, and misuse of HOA funds. He took a plea deal, but not before the local paper ran a story exposing his schemes. His face, once the polished symbol of authority, now stared back from headlines as the cautionary tale of greed and arrogance. Neighbors clipped the article, some hanging it on their refrigerators as a reminder. "Never again," Mrs. Langley muttered when I caught her reading it on her porch. As for me, the fines were erased. Every dollar refunded, every false violation cleared. The HOA board even issued a written apology, though their words felt hollow after their silence during Ethan's reign. Still, it was something. The Cadillac sat in my garage, safe once more. I polished it every Sunday, not just out of habit, but out of gratitude. Gratitude that it was still mine, and that no one, not Ethan, not anyone, had succeeded in stripping it away. Something remarkable happened after Ethan's downfall. The neighborhood, once divided and silent under his control, began to heal. At the next HOA meeting, people spoke freely. No smirks, no intimidation, no whispered rumors. Rules were reviewed, rewritten, and softened. Instead of fines, the board started offering warnings and suggestions. The tension that had choked us for months eased. Neighbors who'd once avoided me now lingered to chat. We shared coffee on porches, swapped gardening tips, even organized a block barbecue, something we hadn't done in years. And in quiet moments, a few confessed their regrets. "I wanted to speak up, Frank," one neighbor admitted, voice heavy, "but he scared us. He made us believe we'd be next." I understood. Fear is a powerful leash, but when one person finally breaks it, the others realize they can too. Looking back, I realized this was never just about a car. The Cadillac was the battleground, yes, but the real fight was over dignity, over the right to hold on to what you've earned, what you love, what defines you, without some entitled tyrant stripping it away. Ethan thought he could bully me into submission because of my age, because of his power, because he controlled the board. But he underestimated something he couldn't see: the strength of memory, of love, of pride that comes from a life well lived. Every mile on that Cadillac's odometer carried a piece of my story. My wife's laughter on road trips, my children asleep in the back seat, my own hands polishing the hood after a long shift at the mill. To Ethan, it was just a trophy. To me, it was everything. And that's why I fought. Because sometimes standing up isn't about winning a battle. It's about refusing to surrender the things that make you you. Today, when I slide into the Cadillac's leather seat and turn the key, I don't just hear the purr of an engine. I hear resilience. I hear survival. I hear the voice of my wife, laughing in the wind, reminding me that dignity is never given. It's defended. Ethan lost his power. He lost his reputation. He lost the very community he tried to control. But I still have my car. I still have my home. And most importantly, I still have my dignity. And no one, not even the likes of Ethan Cole, will ever take that from me again.